So Heidi Skinner, Policy and Public Affairs Manager at the Freight Transport Association. Heidi, come and join us. Alastair Welch, Director from Associated British Ports in Southampton. Welcome, Alastair. Robert Nisbet, Director, Nations and Regions from the Rail Delivery Group. And Catherine Folca, Stakeholder Manager from Transport Focus. These are the ones that are responsible. No, I joke. No, but it's half serious. Before I get into you giving your vote, just give us your thoughts initially on what Billy and Romany said. Robert, to start with, I mean, what do you recognise this problem that we've got, this discontinuity between what you're trying to do and what they want?
Wow. They were really powerful, really powerful. They're beseeching us, really, aren't they? I mean, they're saying, you seem to be ignoring the crisis that we are facing because we are the future, implying that we very much are the past. Mm-hmm. I would say, as the rail industry, we have a pretty good story on the environment.
Well, not according to Billy, a very bad story in terms of
we're going
to
go straight into fares, and I'm going to say exactly what you would expect me to say, that speak to the politicians and the government, because they set the regulated fare prices. We are the least subsidised rail network in Europe. And that is a decision that's been made by successive governments, Labour and Conservative, that they've swung the pendulum away from the taxpayer paying for your railway network and put it onto the passenger. It's about 70% goes onto the shoulders of the passengers of trains, and 30% the taxpayer, whereas if you go to France, Spain, Italy, it's the other way around. So the taxpayers put a lot more money into their railway networks. And frankly, the railway operators don't care where the money comes from, as long as the money comes from somewhere. We're not making enormous profits. Out of every pound you pay for your ticket, about 2p goes into profits, the rest on running the railway. But it's a fair challenge, everything they've said, and we take the point about cleanliness, we take the point about, kind of operations. We need to get a lot better, and we're hoping that what Mr. Williams and the Rail Review has up its sleeve will help the industry work better together.
Catherine, this is nothing new for you, is it? Transport Focus?
You've got my own, thanks. Yeah. Well, as Transport Focus, we're the transport user watchdog, so we do a lot of surveys on passenger satisfaction with different modes of transport, and a lot of the things that you raise are what the wider transport using population complain about. But I think that it's also true that some of the particular needs for the younger generation are more pertinent, such as price. And also in rural areas, availability of transport networks.
Okay. So essentially, they're just agreeing with what you're saying and saying
yes. With you, yeah.
I'm going to drill a bit more deeply into that, but let's move on to I did promise you to give you 5 minutes each at the lectern to state your case. So let's start with Heidi. Heidi from the Freight Transport Association. What for you is what users want? I mean, you can draw on what you've heard here as well, but what do they want in 2050? Heidi.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I will be as concise as possible. Just to say that, how do we work this? How do I slide along? Sorry.
Use that.
There we go. Thank you. There we go. So just very, very briefly, for those that aren't aware, Freight Transport Association, we are a multimodal trade association with 18,000 members in the UK, representing road, rail, sea and air, and also those buyers of freight services, manufacturers and retailers. And our headquarters are in Tunbridge Wells, so we do take an interest in South East in particular. But just to very quickly just talk about our long-term ambitions, looking at freight in the future. What does logistics look like? Obviously, it has to be for us that frictionless movement of goods. As we've highlighted before, I think on a number of occasions today, the South East does have so many international gateways. And if we do want our products to still be reaching us, we need to make sure that those are as frictionless as possible. And we have the capacity, whether that be at the Ro-Ro ports in Dover or Channel Tunnel, Southampton, Gatwick and others across the South East. It's absolutely vital. The surface access and the capacity inside there is sufficient. And into that, obviously, that interlinks the planning. We need to make sure that we can anticipate what the long-term needs for the economy are, what the South East needs, what our communities need, so that we can make sure everything is in place. And that links into the infrastructure. Obviously, if we are moving to 2050, where we see zero emissions, then we need to have infrastructure in place, and particularly grid connections, so that if we are building new freight and logistics depots in the southeast, do they have the substations that can power the number of vehicles that they need? Do those fleet operators who take the van, who send their vans home with the drivers at the end of the day, can they connect those vans up to the right electricity supply? So these things need to be looked at quite clearly. And obviously, we need to make sure that we design our urban areas in particular so that we have the right sort of deliveries at the right times. We don't want any more congestion in our urban areas, so can we look at retiming deliveries? I think communities and businesses would benefit from that. But just finally, just to say that big can be good. Sometimes there is a negativity around freight and the size of it. And I just want to very quickly just go through some slides just to highlight that, one freight train can remove 70 lorries from the road. And obviously the emissions savings there are quite considerable. When we look at the government's longer semi-trailer trial, which has taken place, we're seeing through that trial, which we would like to be permanent, I hasten to add, we're seeing fewer journeys on the road for HGVs, the number of emissions that have been saved. But just finally, if we're looking at urban areas, people often will say, oh, I don't like lorries on the road. Just to highlight, it's the efficiency of the deliveries which is important for us. One medium-sized lorry can carry 10,000 kilograms. That would equate to 10 vans holding 1,000 kilograms or 100 e-cargo bikes. We just need to look at the efficiencies of our logistics. But thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Heidi. Alastair, what's happening in the ports world? Tell us what your vision for 2050 is, and how does it differ from Heidi's?
So I'll try and give a flavour of what's going on in Southampton and perhaps what that looks like in the future. In short, Southampton today, we are the UK's gateway to the world. A little picture of part of the port that we have in Southampton. And the reason that we are the gateway to the world, I would say, is frankly because of lucky geography. Goods coming in to Europe, Northern Europe from America, or in from the south, whether it's Asia or Africa, they absolutely come right past our front door on the way into Europe's biggest ports. And that means if you want to either get hold of goods on the way in or send goods on their way out, you absolutely can get your goods to market much more quickly if you come through Southampton. So going forwards, we are very, very well placed. And whether we're in a current trading environment or a future trading environment, we absolutely recognise that we have a really big opportunity going forwards. Yes, with the UK's biggest manufacturing port, we export over £40 billion of goods made in the UK every year, and 90% of those right now are going outside the EU. And we've got a number of main trades today. In terms of exports, we have a huge number of vehicles we export, both conventional, increasingly hybrid, soon to be electric. We're now doing a lot of work with Tesla about the future and what that looks like, and other manufacturers. The E-Mini starts rolling off the production line in November, and we do expect to see more volume in future, because ironically, if people are moving from conventional forms of transport and power to electric forms of power, the speed with which the range anxiety will be addressed by the improving quality of batteries will mean there is an acceleration of rotation of change of vehicles. So there is a need for us to make sure we can continue to look after that and to allow the UK to keep on trading in the new environment. In terms of cruise, we are Europe's biggest cruise turnaround port. And the irony is cruise ships today might be twice the size of the ships that were around 5 years ago. They're also using half the power. They're also now using LNG as a much tidier, cleaner way of operating. And of course, if you've got 6,000 passengers who want to go on holiday and they're going on a cruise ship powered by LNG, arguably that's a rather better solution than putting 6,000 people in the air to go somewhere else. But either way, longer term, we do expect more bigger ships, which are both more fuel efficient and running with different fuels. But as well as being big on exports and big on cruise, we are second biggest import port into the UK. And the stuff that comes into the UK, frankly, comes in boxes on great big ships. The ships that come in now, that's got about 20-odd thousand containers on it, and that's twice the size of a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. So these are big ships, and they are much bigger than they used to be, but of course they are so much more fuel efficient than they used to be, and the new generation coming out now are also LNG fueled. So they're getting much, much cleaner as time goes on. Also, you may or may not be aware, if you want to come into ports, say in Southampton, you must use low sulfur fuels, which is not the case at all ports, either in Europe or necessarily in the UK. But the bigger ships are much more fuel efficient. In terms of the future, we're in a pretty good place. The huge Exxon refinery in our water in Fawley, it is the UK's biggest refinery. They're putting £1 billion, $1 billion right now into investing for the future, and they will be the ideally located place in the UK for hydrogen manufacture going forwards. And we're absolutely certain that LNG is a transitional fuel, and we're convinced that hydrogen will become the fuel of the future once we can work out, once our fine new brains, which are much cleverer than ours, can work out how we can crack hydrogen more cost efficiently. In terms of containers, we do expect to see more product through containers, and we need to make sure that we can handle those bigger ships which are coming, and that means dredging channels that work for them. In terms of cruise, we are seeing more ships. They are bigger, and they are much, much more fuel efficient. And the challenge for us is how do we support those with shore power in port, which is clean. So lots going on there. In terms of ports generally and what we trade, about 95% of British trade in goods were moved by sea. So aviation, critical for high-value products or particularly urgent products, but basically goods move internationally by sea, and in the UK, they move by rail, and the last few miles are by road. And we'd be kidding ourselves to think to the contrary today. In terms of the long term and what's going on, we need to make sure that we are not at the end of the UK, but we absolutely remain the UK's gateway to the world. To do that, we need to make sure that connectivity absolutely works, whether by rail or by road. We have invested a fortune, and we continue doing so, to make sure that rail activity is enabled to and from the port. We want to keep that growing, but in terms of roads, we need to make sure we have good access, yes, into the main markets in London, but critically to the manufacturing centres in the Midlands, because going forwards, if the UK is going to grow exports and grow exports as a proportion of GDP, we need to make sure we can trade globally, and we are ideally placed for that. We need to make sure that we connect manufacturers in the UK with the key trading corridors. So lots to do, but the real challenge is how we can make people and goods move around cost effectively and environmentally efficiently. That's all from me.
Thank you very much. Alastair. Robert, we heard a bit earlier about your response to Billy and Romany, but tell us about the bigger picture. Rail Delivery Group, what's its view about what users want in 2050?
Thank you very much indeed. I'm actually going to go naked, so I have no slides. Just don't get too nervous. Just to explain what the Rail Delivery Group is, we are effectively the trade body. So we represent not just the private train operating companies, but also Network Rail. So both the private and public sides of the railway. And just a little bit about me. I'm Director Nations and Regions, but also the broadcast spokesperson for the rail industry. And I started in April last year. So as most of you will have realised, that was a month before last year's May timetable changes. And I just moved from my job as Brexit correspondent at Sky. So basically, I cause trouble wherever I go. So hopefully, I won't do the same here at the lectern today. But it's interesting, kind of looking forward to 2050. We know that the railway is growing in a way, in many ways. It's been a victim of its own success. It's doubled in terms of passenger numbers since privatisation in the 90s, and we're expecting it to grow substantially again. But there are 5 kind of overarching strategic challenges confronting kind of all sectors of the economy, which rail must rise to in response. And we've heard a number of them today, but it's good to underline them, I think, as a as a contextual point to this discussion. The health of the economy, environmental challenges, the affordability of public services, increased availability of digital technology, and the expected growth of the UK population. Let's remember by 2050, the UK population is expected to be 77 million. Now, at RDG, unsurprisingly, we believe that rail is critical to meeting all 5 of those challenges. And I think you two basically touched on 4 of them in your bit a little bit earlier on the stage. Now, to address those and to look into the future, you will be well aware that there is the Williams review kind of grinding away in the background. And I was saying earlier at lunch, in many ways, one of the benefits of Brexit, at least at the moment, is that this Williams review, which is looking at all aspects of how the industry is kind of plumbed together, has been carrying on pretty much undisturbed by day-to-day politics. So we are looking forward to hearing what the Williams review comes out with. And we heard at the Conservative Party conference from the Secretary of State that potentially it will be November or towards the end of this year where a white paper will set out the recommendations. Now, again, unsurprisingly, we as the industry have fed in what we think should happen to the industry. And I think I just want to run through some of those points because I think it is pertinent to this discussion about what it could look like in 2050. We believe there needs to be a fundamental change to the way that the fare system runs in this country. At the moment, back in the 1990s, when the ticket and settlement agreement came out, the idea behind it was pretty sound. There are 2,500 stations in Great Britain, and the idea was you could buy a ticket from anywhere to go to anywhere. But the problem is that we have regulated ticket types, ticket bundles, and that means in the fares computer at the moment, there are 55 million different fares. So pretty much one for every single person, man, woman and child in the United Kingdom. And part of the problem, we're talking a lot about integrated transport solutions, mobility as a system, and, being able to travel, say, from your house to your final destination by maybe taking, a Boris bike or an e-bike. And then, can we call them Boris bikes anymore? You know what I mean anyway. And then getting on to a train and having one ticket that can take you across all of those different modes. At the moment, with our regulated system, it's very difficult for the national fare system to talk to other fare systems because of the way that they are bundled together. We need it to be broken down and then built back up, which would allow pay-as-you-go systems around the country and not just in London, which is its own very particular beast. We also believe that there should be an organising body, a FAT controller, an SRA Mark II, if you will, that takes the day-to-day running of the railways out of the day-to-day politics of Westminster. It needs to be objective and independent, an arbiter of the competing interests to provide one guiding mind for the railway. And that then would allow you to devolve greater powers to local areas. And this is obviously something that TFSE and the other sub-national transport bodies would, we believe, welcome. We also saw last March that targets and incentives are not always aligned in the industry, and we believe that needs to change. We think the franchising system has had its day. It is too rigid, it is too overspecified, and we need to see a different system of contracts, some of which could be based on outcomes. So if you want to increase passenger satisfaction to 95%, you give the train operator the ability to do that without saying exactly how they should do it. Could be that the coffee's better or the seats are more comfortable or that there are just more services available. And the final point, I think I'm preaching to the converted when I say this, that we believe as an industry that where appropriate, decisions about the railway need to come down to the communities that they serve. And with our proposals, with these proposals I'm laying out, TFSE could take on greater powers around fares as well as the letting of contracts on the heavy rail network. And we believe that these proposals would have a knock-on effect. I'll wrap up. I had a lot more to say, but I'll wrap up here by saying that we think that these proposals would make the railway adaptable and flexible enough so that we don't sit in our modal silos, that actually we start communicating a lot more with one another, and we can do that digitally, as well as making profound impacts on a low-carbon economy, which, you know, I noticed at all the party conferences. We've still got the SNP to go, but all the party conferences that I've been to so far, I was expecting the rail discussion to be centred almost entirely around fares, thank you very much, and HS2. But actually, it was about decarbonisation. And rail has a good record on decarbonisation. It needs to be kind of even better. But we think all of these proposals that would help, you know, the rail industry thrive would also help us, you know, bolster the environmental case for the railway. So I'm going to finish there because I know there are going to be questions later on, but those are our plans for what we would like to see the railway look like in 2050. Thank you
Robert,
very much.
thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. And finally, Catherine Folca from Transport Focus. How do passengers see the transport situation in 2050?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Catherine Folca, and I'm a stakeholder manager with Transport Focus. And for those of you who don't know what we do, we are the transport user watchdog. And as part of our remit, we carry out regular passenger satisfaction surveys across all modes of transport, rail, bus, tram, and also road user satisfaction surveys. So these surveys tell us about what transport users' needs and aspirations are, and also, most importantly for most operators, what their satisfaction levels are currently. So I thought, oh, hang on, it's not working. Yes, it is. So just quickly have a look at the key drivers of satisfaction across these different modes of transport. So this is from the National Rail Passenger Survey, which we carry out twice a year. So it's surveying about 50,000 passengers in total per annum. And this is looking at the key drivers of satisfaction for the South East sector, combining the spring and autumn survey waves. And as you can see, the key driver of satisfaction there is punctuality and reliability. And this tends to compare, this is the same as the national picture, there's not much difference. And the key driver of dissatisfaction is how delays are dealt with, the provision of information being the key challenge there. So if you look at bus passengers, so this is bus passengers in England, but not outside of London. That's London Travel Watch's remit. And so what makes a satisfactory journey is punctuality, again, the key core product, really. And what makes a great journey for a bus passenger is their interaction with the bus driver, which is key to making that from a sort of acceptable journey to a key journey. And road user satisfaction, so what factors influence road user satisfaction is journey time. And the other factors underneath that all are things that relate to journey time. So for all these different modes of transport, currently the key drivers of satisfaction are really the core product, being able to rely on it and it being punctual. So if we talk about or have a think about how that might change in the future, I think if you go back to, say, the 1950s and consider if somebody was transported over to today, they would instantly recognise the physical features of bus and rail travel today. There'd be some changes, but the key physical features would be the same, and that would really be the same for roads as well. The cars would be different, but the structure of the road and the vehicles on it would be the same. And the aspirations of today's passengers would also be theirs, reliability and punctuality. They wouldn't recognise the technology, and the social changes which have occurred since the 1950s, well, they wouldn't be immediately apparent to them. But these are some of the factors that we think will influence transport user needs in the future. The ageing population, people are living longer and they're also more active, which implies they may work longer, they will travel more, they will participate in society more, and they will need to use transport in order to do that. So things that are already very important, step-free access, reducing the gap between the train and the platform, low-floor buses, these things will become key to a growing proportion of the travelling population, and it will continue to grow. It's not likely to diminish. And then growth of the single-person lifestyle. People, hang on, I've lost my card. 1 minute. People are getting married later. They are also getting divorced more. The traditional family unit is in decline, apparently, and the average size of the UK household is also going down. So these things, as they progress, are likely to result in a desire for more socialising and more frequent activities, and so a greater reliance on public transport. And so public transport could have a key role in this, but one of the key things will be timetables able to provide the services when people need them, which could look quite different in 20 years from now to what it is today. And then also the pull of the city. I mean, currently, rail is great at getting people in and out of cities, and buses and trams get them around the cities. But if there are significant changes in where people live and work, then this will have a big impact on the transport needs of the commuter. And then finally, how we work. I mean, as we all know, there's a sort of a decentralisation of working practices at the moment, more flexible working times and more flexible days. And while it's unlikely that the need to go into the office will disappear completely, these changes in work patterns are likely to change the demand pressure on the traditional peak commuter services, which will relieve that period of travel, but also it will mean there'll be a need to strengthen services at other times. And also technology. While technology currently does already reduce the requirement to meet, the need to meet face-to-face, I believe, is a sort of essential human need. And so there will still be the need to have face-to-face meetings to build relationships and to conduct business. But what could well change in the future is where these meetings take place. For example, many may already conduct this kind of business in coffee shops, but why not train stations? At train stations, why not have facilities where people can have meetings? And for example, maybe onboard trains as well. I know in Italy, they have executive carriages where businesses can hire the whole carriage and they can have meetings and conduct board meetings and stuff while they travel. So maybe we will see some things like that, which will change working patterns. But I think all these factors here, the ageing population, the growth of the single person lifestyle, the pull of the city and how we work, will be the things that will impact on people's transport needs as we go forward into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Right, we're going to have 10 minutes or so questions. Let's kick off. I mean, we've mentioned quite a few changes and disruptors. I mean, what do you think? Let's start with Heidi. I mean, what do you think the big disruptors are going to be when it comes to transport? I mean, you mentioned the fact that I think Alastair mentioned hydrogen, that the new fuels, etc. What for you in the freight world is going to really potentially move the dial?
Well, I think we need to, it was mentioned in the session before, more R&D particularly, because I think when we look at heavy goods vehicles, electricity is not a viable option at the moment. Not to say it won't be in the future, but we need more progress in that area. And even when you look at sort of lighter goods vehicles, the the availability, the lead times for manufacturers, it can be about 9 months. The cost involved as well is, over double what you would have for an equivalent diesel. So I think we just need to see more movement in that area to allow, particularly in the road haulage sector, to have that availability and that option to actually pick a more efficient vehicle.
So it's not going to be, you're not thinking like drones. We hear a lot about kind of delivery drones. We look at that kind of far out, quite radical technology.
I mean, you can't rule that out, but I mean, I think, from the last slide where I put up and just said, it's the efficiency of deliveries, I think, is very important, particularly in urban areas. So, you can't rule out the fact that a lorry can actually carry a very high payload, which will go into an urban area. And, a drone will only be limited by what it can carry.
Robert?
I would say data, and I know it's been mentioned before, but we gather as train operating companies and Network Rail as well, we gather an enormous amount of data, and we're almost swamped by it, to be honest. And the quality doesn't always keep up with the quantity, but we are learning more now about our passenger movements than ever before. And RDG is running an initiative called Wavelength, which the Department for Transport is supporting. And that is seeing, kind of train operating companies that aren't always the best of friends, because often they're competing with each other for businesses, for franchises, for example. But they are sharing data, and we're being able to put together a very rich wavelength of the passenger journey, and we're learning a lot from it.
There's a question here on side. What are the Rail Delivery Group doing to integrate rail journeys seamlessly with local transport, walking and cycling? That's presumably data-led.
It is part of it. I mean, Wavelength starts with when the passenger is thinking of the journey they're about to take, not when they arrive at the railway station. And up until now, that's traditionally where the rail bodies such as RDG and ATOC before have been gathering their data. And it's seeing it as a seamless journey going from mode to mode. But again, I go back to what I was saying earlier. In order to make that a reality for passengers to travel seamlessly, we need to have ticketing systems that are also seamless, that join together, that speak together. And, as we move away from paper tickets, and there's going to be a significant announcement next week about how far we are moving away from paper tickets, to even ourselves being our tickets, just the body walking through, kind of various sensors, for example. But in order for that to be joined up and to work with other modes, we need to have the regulations changed, and that requires parliamentary or government activity to be able to make these ticket systems talk to one another.
Catherine, there's a question here around data. It says with 5G and 4IR, what will happen with data? Also, will Transport for South East make data available for developers to make new apps in the way that Transport for London does? Is that something which you would be driving from Transport Focus and recommending?
It's something we'd recommend. I mean, anything that enables people to travel more easily. And I think there's so much information to be held from all the data collected by different sources. So,
no, but certainly knowing when the bus is going to arrive is a key part of bus usage.
Well, it is, and there are so many different apps out there for different aspects of travel. But there are so many that I think what a lot of people tend to do is they tend to go onto Google to plan their journey. Okay. And so it's also a question of integrating these multitudes of apps that are out there.
Heidi, there's a question on. I'm going to come. If you've got a question for the floor, yeah, put your hand. Get a microphone at the front. There's a question here, Heidi, about should we be limiting the amount of? I'm trying to find it now. Should we be limiting the amount of online shopping? Is the future of unregulated, expanding online shopping, and i.e. deliveries to the door? Is that going to really kind of hinder us in the future?
Sorry. I don't think that it's something that we can limit. I think people clearly enjoy online shopping, use it. I mean, I'm a big advocate myself, and I think it's. I think we just need to work out what the efficiency of those delivery methods are. I think that's vitally important. I mean, we saw in London recently there were certain councils were very keen to stop deliveries to workplaces, and we said actually that's a really good hub. You know, if you're taking a lot of parcels to one central place and then dispersing it out to the employees, that's a distribution centre. So that's not a negative. So I think it's just about how we can have those efficient deliveries.
Okay. Alastair, you mentioned hydrogen. There's a question here which I'm not sure I necessarily understand. How is hydrogen transported? Is the assumption that that you will be transporting hydrogen around? I don't know. What are your let's get into hydrogen. What for you is the is that the big disruptor then in shipping? Because shipping is a major emitter of CO2. Is hydrogen the kind of the big changing element?
I think for many modes of transport, if you know, the holy grail in some ways, if we could find a way to use a sustainable source to turn water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then basically burn that using oxygen to generate water and get energy out of it, that has to be a very clever way of doing things. And a challenge with hydrogen is how do you safely transport it? Well, just as LNG on a very large ship is fine because it's in pressurized containers and it works very well, you can do the same thing with hydrogen. The challenge is at the moment there is no cost-effective way of generating it. So if you have a very large supply of sustainable energy, and at the moment, it's places like the Emirates who can use huge amounts of solar power, or in Norway, where you have huge amounts of hydropower, you can generate hydrogen. And at the moment, it has a very, very small use, really on a trial basis in certain cars and that sort of thing. My personal view is in the next 20 years, we'll crack that because we have to. And I think by 2050, 2060, it'll become a mainstream energy source for certain modes of transport. And again, my personal view is private vehicles, private transport, if we can generate the power sustainably and store it effectively, we'll see far more electric vehicles, as we'd expect. I think that some of the largest vessels will be hydrogen fueled. What I don't know is how we resolve the challenge of either the concept of a train, trains are fine whilst the power is there, and then when you run out of electric line, it gets difficult. And the thought of electrifying some of the more remote lines in Norfolk is interesting economically. But equally, if we're into HGVs and how we have sustainable power to generate the ability for them to get the distance they need to get to, I don't know the answer to that yet.
Well, I believe there's actually a plant that's opened in Chester, which turns plastic into unrecyclable plastic into hydrogen. I don't know if it's a trial or whether it's cost effective, but it's happening.
Great
stuff is happening. The question here is: this is going to be rail specific, isn't it?
Yes, but
far away.
Daniel Puddicombe. Just before I do that, speaking as a slightly older, younger person to Billy, I'm 24. I looked it up whilst you were speaking. A day return ticket from Brighton to London is £24 using a 16 to 17 card. That works out at 4.1p per mile. And also, it's a lot cheaper to to catch a train to Birmingham than Berlin. 60 quid versus 145. You pay on the day. But so actually, we're doing Robert's job for him. I think that rail prices are quite cheap. With that out of the way,
discuss.
Heidi, on the rail front, obviously the government set its 2040 challenge to decarbonise the rail network. Freight is obviously a big challenge. What are the challenges that your sector faces, and how are you overcoming them? How likely is it, do you think, that there will be no diesel locomotives on the network? What will they be powered by? I mean, hydrogen is in its infancy, and electrification doesn't seem to be high on the agenda at the moment. Alastair, I've got a question for you as well. So sorry. Given you mentioned that you want more rail freight traffic to your ports, how are you coping with trying to get paths in there, considering that there is greater passenger services going along those lines. Robert?
Whoa. Heidi, give the microphone back. Who let the journalists in? Heidi, what's the future of rail freight?
Well, I think electrification obviously is the key, and I think it's unfortunate that certain schemes have been cancelled. But that is something that we have to continue to lobby on, because obviously that is the most sensible solution at the moment. There is obviously more research and development that needs to be done into other options, but I think yes, we need to work harder on the electrification schemes.
Because Robert, I mean, to a certain extent, politically, rail freight is seen as being the kind of the ugly sister.
Well, yeah, I mean, freight...
If that's a good phrase, is that a good metaphor? I don't know.
Freight doesn't vote, and I think that's the issue.
That's what I was saying, yes.
Yeah, freight doesn't vote, and the problem, I think, even within the industry itself, and I think any freight colleagues out there would agree that freight too often is relegated to kind of AOB at the end of a meeting. But in the substance of this discussion and talking about, the climate emergency, then the discussion about freight cannot be pushed under the carpet.
It doesn't solve Billy's problem. It doesn't solve Romany's problem. That's the issue around freight. It's not obvious that it solves their problem. So politically, it's a difficult one.
Yes, unless you start kind of putting, figures to it or trying to graphically demonstrate that, as Heidi did in that slide a little bit earlier on with the freight train, and what that actually, looks like in terms of the lorries that it takes off the road. I mean, we've been talking about this with disruption, that if we're trying to make a railway built around the customer, which is a lot of the discussion in the industry at the moment, when you talk about several trains, or the perturbation was kind of this severe. If you start talking about a population the size of Basingstoke was delayed by this train that was late, then you start to get political minds thinking about this issue as well.
Okay, Alastair, talk about the issue of making room for freight imports.
Yeah, so one of the challenges that we have is we will have, so today we've got about 54,000 automotive units on the port, and they'll rotate in the next week. So we have to get them in and get them out pretty quickly. So we will have, say, 2 car trains a day will come down from Oxford with Mini-on, about 300 cars on each, and 2 come down from Halewood every day, and others from other parts. So we'll have a lot of product come in every day by rail, and we'll have around about 25 freight trains leaving the port with containers that are come into the UK and so on. The challenge we actually have at the moment, which is rather one we hadn't predicted, is because these container ships are getting much larger, we might have, say, a large container ship every 3 days rather than 3 small ones every day or something. And so you might have 4,000 boxes come off a train, which means you'll have a couple of days when they off a ship. You might then have a day or 2 when the freight trains are absolutely rammed, and then you'll have a couple of days when they're very quiet. And so the peaky nature really doesn't help rail activity. And so the challenge for us is how we better match the rail activity to the changing activity on the water. So it's one we're trying to get ahead of, but it's not easy to do because train paths, as you say, are interesting.
Okay. Very, very quick question, so running out of time, but make it very, very quick.
Tony Parker at Shoreham Port. Again, if I could just add a little bit to what Alastair said earlier about future fuel types. Hydrogen isn't going to do big ships for long distances. It will be ammonia because it's twice as dense energy-wise. But it isn't a matter of technology that we need. There are 60 electric ferries in Norway. There are hydrogen ships and electric ships plying the big rivers in Northern Europe. Frankly, we would love at Shoreham to get some of those ships into our port as well. LNG is not the future because LNG is a fossil fuel, and we've got to stop using fossil fuels, and we've got to do it pretty quick.
Great. On that note, I think we'll call it to halt now because I want to get you off for a coffee and get you back in time for the Minister. So thanks to our panel, Heidi, Alastair, Robert and Catherine. Thank you very much. Round of applause.